My name's Chris, and I repair my own audio equipment, and I also show you how to repair yours. So let's get started. This Marantz 2500 was stuck in a closet in Texas, just collecting dust, never to make music again. That's not happening on my watch. Join me as I take you through the repair, restoration, and the recovery of one of the most iconic receivers ever produced, the Marantz 2500. Not every piece of equipment that I have is in mint condition, but I treat each of them with respect. Each of them can still continue on for decades, even if they'll never look like new pieces of equipment. And I treat all of my equipment the same way. This Marantz 2500 received the exact same treatment as if it came brand new out of the box. It doesn't matter to me. I'm going to treat it the same way. I'm going to change out those electrolytic capacitors that need to be changed out after 45 years. I'm going to clean it up a little bit. I'll end up putting it into my system and listening to it, and it just deserves that. And I'm sure that even though this receiver will never look perfect, it will sound perfect by the time I'm done with it. Before I can listen to it, I've got to get it up on the test bench. But before I get it up on the test bench, I'm going to have to go in there and restore it. And you guys know me, the first thing I'm going to do is take a look at this unit before I power it up. So let's get started. If you haven't already, please subscribe. I think the first thing you should do, no matter what piece of vintage audio equipment that you obtain, is take a look at it first. Just get it home, put it somewhere, and just take a look from the outside and see what issues you have. Take a look at the front, take a look at the case, take a look at the back, and just see what you've got to start out with. Looking at the front of the Marantz 2500, I noticed that the balance knob is missing off of the balance control. Now the shaft is still there, which is good. I've got a 2385 Marantz receiver where that shaft was broken off on the balance control, and that's a bigger problem. So that's one issue I see. I'm just glad the shaft's there and just the chrome knob is missing. Also, over at the left by the oscilloscope display, the vertical control is missing the chrome cap off of the knob. So those are the two main issues I see as far as the front goes. Of course, as you can see, the faceplate itself is quite dirty, and I'll get to that later on. For right now, I just need to figure out what to do about the balance control and also the vertical control on the oscilloscope, what I'm going to use for knobs. I ended up using the balance control knob from a Marantz 2265. It looks fine, and the knob fit the shaft correctly. For a replacement oscilloscope knob, I got into my little pile of extra knobs and went ahead and made one myself. From left to right, what was left of the original oscilloscope vertical center knob, the knob I used to make the new knob, then the completed knob. I removed the plastic from the replacement knob, which made the knob more closely match the 2500's original chrome knob. The new knob was slightly larger than the other scope's knob, so I just moved the level control to the vertical position. I then installed the newly created knob on the scope's level control shaft. This just made the 2500 look more complete. You know, the level knob is slightly larger than the other two, but this 2500 looks so much better now. You wouldn't know it if you didn't know it. Some of you may be thinking, why are you showing me this cosmetic stuff? Let's get started on the troubleshooting of this 2500. This isn't very interesting. The reason I show you this is that the cosmetic parts of the vintage audio equipment, those are the ones that are very difficult to come by. You can't get on Mauser.com or Digikey.com and order a part, or get one from the OEM manufacturer like Marantz. You can't get a hold of them and say, could you send me a knob for balance control for 2500? They don't exist. So I just wanted to show you different ways that you can go about making do with what you have. You may have an old piece of equipment, you may have some old knobs. If you don't have any of that, sometimes you can find these on eBay. So usually you can find some sort of workaround to find the cosmetic parts that you may need for your particular unit, like I did for this 2500. The same goes for the wood case that I was lucky enough to obtain with this unit. This is an original Marantz 2500 wood case that was an option back in the day. And you just have to make do with what you've got because there's no replacements for them. At least original replacements. This unit came with its original wood case. It's beat up. There's no doubt about it. It's scraped up at the corners. They're broke off. They're pushed in. The grills at the top of the case are pushed in. Something heavy was sitting on them. But you know, that's okay with me. I really don't care. In the past, years ago, I might look at it and say, oh, no, I've got to do something about this. I've got to refinish this case. But you know, I don't think that's something I should do with this unit and with most units anymore. I just don't. I'll clean it up. I'll make it look as good as I can, because I think all these nicks and scrapes and scratches and missing pieces of wood, it tells a story of this unit, and it tells a story of how durable these units are, that they can be beat up, but they can still function well, and that's my main thing. So I'm going to go ahead and clean up the case, get the dirt, get the grime, get the dog and cat hair out of it, that kind of thing. But I'm not going to do anything else with it other than put a little bit of wood polish on it and make it look decent, but not worry about it not looking perfect. The rear panel of the Marantz 2500 looked fine. With the 2500 out of its wood case, now it's time to take a little bit deeper look at it before I can go ahead and feel comfortable with powering it up. And what I do at this point is to take the covers off, and you want to take a good look inside the unit the best you can with your eyes, just to make sure you don't see anything obvious that would prevent you from powering this unit up. You don't know what's in there. You open up the cover and there could be pieces all over the place. Who knows? There could be burnt components. You just don't know what you're going to see, or maybe you see nothing. I always follow the same routine for any piece of vintage audio equipment that I obtain that I know nothing about.
The first thing I see from the top is that the soft start relay is missing its plastic cover. In addition, that relay is loose in its housing. You know, these covers don't just fall off relays. So this 2500 had been worked on at some point and probably abandoned. There's a lot of dirt in the relay where the plastic case would normally protect it, so this is probably many, many years ago when this was worked on. There's no case on the relay, so there is no identification number. The service manual, along with the pin configuration, should help me figure out what relay to replace it with.
As I researched this relay, it made me think for a minute about all the times people will say to me, you can't get the parts for this stuff anymore, can you? And 99% of the parts you can still get. Something like this relay and the cover being missing makes it more difficult, but it's still possible to find the part that you need. And I can't tell you how many times people have said they've taken their equipment to somebody and they say they just don't make the parts for it no more. What they're really trying to tell you is they don't want to spend the time finding the parts. And a lot of times that's because the people who want their equipment repaired don't want to pay them to find the parts. Working on vintage stereo equipment's no different than calling your electrician or calling your plumber. you're going to shake their hand and, they're going to charge you $100. It's just the way it is. And the same thing with vintage audio or anybody competent that's going to work on it. You've got to expect when you take your piece of vintage audio equipment somewhere that they're going to have to spend quite a bit of time with it, not just to diagnose the problem, but to find out the parts that you need. As you guys know, a lot of my videos are geared toward folks that don't have a lot of experience. So hopefully that helps you to be able to do your own work, do your own troubleshooting, spend your own time, and not only do you save money, but you'll learn something. Trying to learn something in the beginning is always difficult. Doesn't matter what it is, whether it's vintage audio equipment or some other skill that you guys out there have. Once you practice, you get better and better, and before you know it, you can buzz right through a lot of these vintage audio products without a lot of difficulty. I ordered the relay from DigiKey. It's also available from Mauser and several other electronic supply companies here in the United States. So it's readily available. It cost me about $25 and I got it installed and now I'm ready to move on. Well, as it turns out, I didn't have to move very far.
Just to the left of the relay, there's a power resistor. The red wire, you can see, is stuck to the power resistor. Power resistors get very hot. The insulation from the wire just melted to the resistor. You can almost bet, this wasn't how it was, obviously, when it left the factory 40 years ago. This is only 2,500 I've worked on, but it would not leave the factory. Either it was restrained with a tie wrap or it was routed different, something, but they're not going to run wires right up against a power resistor so the insulation can melt.
So finding this relay issue, along with the wire being melted up against the power resistor, you can see how important it is just to look at a unit. And you really didn't need any skill to find these issues other than to get the cover off and take a good look. Now, these were the only two issues that I found, but they're pretty big issues. I would much rather have seen these problems before I plugged it in and turned it on. What would have happened? I don't know. But I would just as soon get those issues behind me before I even think about powering the unit up. And talking about powering up this 2500, I'm a little bit apprehensive to do it. Even though I've worked on a lot of pieces of vintage audio equipment, I always have a concern on any piece I know nothing about. And I know nothing about this piece of equipment. So the last thing I want to do is to blow up this 2500 in some manner that I could have prevented. So for right now, I know the faceplate's in really rough shape. I know there's a lot of cleaning to be done, so I'm still not going to power up this 2500. I'm going to go ahead and get the faceplate off first and work on cleaning it up a little bit. As you can tell, this faceplate's rough. It's got a lot of dirt, a lot of probably either dog or cat hair in it. It's not unusual. A lot of these pieces of equipment end up after a period of years. They were used at one point and either the person who had it no longer wanted it, or they gave it away, or whatever happened, and they just store it away and they get dirty. This faceplate is in pretty rough shape as far as dirt and grime, maybe a little nicotine stains, that kind of thing. But fortunately, the stenciling looks pretty good. It's not like all the lettering's gone. So that makes me feel pretty good that I can probably get it cleaned up, again, from experience of other faceplates. And the first thing you want to do on any piece of an aluminum faceplate anyway, like the Marantz 2500 has, is just use the least abrasive thing you can use at first, which would be some warm water, a little bit of dish soap, some Q-tips, a rag. Just start scrubbing that stuff off and see what you can get off and what you can't. If you can get it all off with that, great. If you can't, then you got to move to something else. After pulling the animal hair out of it and getting it cleaned up the best I could, still, down in that aluminum faceplate, there was crud that I could not get with soap and water and dish soap. So what I use, and I have used for many years, is Mother's Mag Polish. And it's always worked well for me. but I'm not telling you to use it on your precious piece of equipment. I would try it in a little spot and see how it works, but it will get down in that aluminum faceplate and pull all that crud out of there and make any aluminum faceplate that I've worked on look better without damaging that stenciling, without taking the lettering off. Now, once again, I'm not telling you to use it. I'm telling you what I use, and it's up to you to decide what to use on your piece of equipment. Now a quick word from our sponsor.
Marantz. One of the world's greatest names in stereo sound products. Marantz Stereo has a true musical sound with virtually no distortion to come between you and the music. Whatever music you enjoy it more on Marantz Stereo. Marantz is music.
As you guys know that follow my videos, I really enjoy the history of the vintage audio equipment also. I like finding these old commercials, and this commercial happens to show the Marantz 2500. I didn't realize that at first until I went back and slowed it up, and it's the 2500. I could see the oscilloscope. I wasn't sure if it was the 2500 or the 2600, and it was the 2500. And interesting enough, they show all the components for the 2500. They show the internal parts of the 2500, including the power transformer, the filter capacitors, even that soft start relay I had to change out, along with the power amplifier assemblies, and their unique way of mounting the power transistors on these smaller finned heat sinks. All right, it's time to get back into the repair and restoration of this amazing Marantz 2500 stereo receiver, one of the most iconic receivers ever built. I worked on this faceplate for some time to get it cleaned up, and as I mentioned earlier, I haven't even powered this unit up. I went ahead and cleaned it up first. This is a little bit unusual for me, but this is just to show you there's no 100% correct way of working on vintage audio equipment. I felt like cleaning up the faceplate because I was a little bit apprehensive about powering it up. It was something I had to do anyway. Allows me some time to think about what I'm going to do when I do power it up, because once again, I want to be ultra careful with this particular unit and not have a surprise. I've had surprises before. I don't have them very often, but I don't want to have one with this unit, that's for sure. So I went ahead and I cleaned it up, and I knew I was going to have to put the faceplate somewhere else for a period of time. And whenever you're working on something cosmetic like this, it could get scratched up or dirty. I just wrap it in a little piece of bubble wrap and put it aside. I don't put it on my workbench. I just put it aside, and that way it can't get hit by a soldering iron or just a screwdriver or something stupid to mar it for no good reason. So I got everything cleaned up, and I went ahead and I removed the faceplate and I put it in some bubble wrap, and now I'm getting closer to powering up this Marantz 2500. It's always a good idea to power up any unknown piece of vintage audio equipment with a variac. This way you can slowly increase the voltage instead of hitting it with that 120 volts all at once like we have here in the United States, because you don't know how long it's been since this 2500's been powered up. So it's always a good idea. Do you have to do that? No, but it just gives you a little better feeling that you can slowly power it up, and if you have any issues, hopefully you can find those before something bad happens. Here I just show my Marantz 10B tuner as I'm powering it up for the first time very slowly. But the procedure is the same. It doesn't matter if it's a Marantz 10B tube tuner or if it's a Marantz 2500 receiver. It's always a good idea to do that. There were no issues on the initial power up, but
after I powered up the 2500 for the first time, I noticed that none of the function indicator LEDs were working. PIC FM, AM, phono, nothing. It was dead. That little indicator board needs 8 volts AC to operate. I didn't have any voltage to the board, so there's a good reason why it wasn't working. I found a broken wire that jumpers the 8 volts AC from the dial lamp board to the function indicator via, like I say, just via a wire. So I just jumpered it. And I figured, well, that should do it. Well, I had 8 volts, still didn't work. So anyway, after troubleshooting, I found a shorted diode on the indicator board. And after fixing the wire and putting in a new diode, we had, the function board worked. But this is how these things are. And anything that's 40 years old, don't care if it's an old car, an old piece of stereo equipment, you're probably going to have multiple problems.
Before I show you everything that I had to do to get this Marantz 2500 up and running, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Marantz 2500. First of all, I want to bring up just the one Achilles heel with the Marantz 2500 and the Marantz 2600, and that's the power transformer. There appears to be, over the years, several of them that have failed. I say several of them, what does that mean? I don't really know, because not a whole lot of these units were manufactured. The 2500, there was around 1,700 of them manufactured total. The 2600, there was under 1,000. So there's not many of them manufactured. There's been enough people who own the two receivers that have reported problems to make you think there may be an issue with some of them. Now, I've never had an issue with mine, but doesn't mean I'm not going to have one. But I've got the original transformer that came from Marantz in 1977. And as I said, there was only about 1,700 of these units produced from 1977 to 1979. So if you have an issue with your power transformer, it's a big deal. It's going to be an expensive fix. There actually is an aftermarket power transformer that's available for these units for around $1,200 US. That's quite a bit, and that's just for the part. And then you've got to do the work to put it in or pay somebody to put it in. So it's something you just as soon avoid. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you ever run upon one of these units, that make sure the power transformer is good, or don't offer a whole lot of money for it. Normally I would just say, well, if a unit doesn't power up, don't worry about it. It's not going to be the transformer. I've never had a transformer bad in any of my equipment, ever. But in this unit, if I came upon one that wouldn't power up, that's the first thing I'm thinking about. I'm going to make sure, if that's the problem, then I'm going to get the unit for a very reasonable price. So other than the power transformer, all the other electronic parts are still available. They may not be the exact same part. Many times the modern equivalent is superior to the capacitor or the transistor or whatever it is that you're attempting to replace in your vintage piece of audio equipment. Cosmetic items are more difficult to obtain because you can't go to Mauser or DigiKey or some other part house and order knobs or a faceplate for a Marantz 2500. You have to either scavenge them off a donor unit, or you have to find something that will work. And usually you can. A lot of times the knobs that were used for several years on several different models. And that's usually something that you can get around, whether you get on eBay and find some used knobs, or you've got another piece of equipment that you can scavenge off of to replace some knobs that maybe are missing. Now, the faceplate's a different story. That's unique to that particular model unit, and that's much more difficult if you need a faceplate. But fortunately, most of the time, the faceplates are still intact on these vintage units. All right, now to talk a little bit about the specifications of this Marantz 2500. It produces 250 watts per channel into 8 ohms, a massive 330 watts per channel into 4 ohms, with a total harmonic distortion rating of 0.05%. And this was in 1977, and I want to talk a little bit about how receivers got to this point in 1977. Because in 1974, just 3 years before the highest rated receiver was 100 watts per channel. And suddenly 3 years later, we're at 250 watts per channel, a huge increase. 1974 was a major year for specification changes. The FTC came out with new parameters of how you rate audio amplifiers for the commercial market, and this put the playing field level for everybody. Before then, you might have a 50 watt per channel amplifier that somebody says is 50 watts, but your 5 watt amplifier would outperform it because they would have some bogus music power rating or something else. So the FTC, to level this out and to stop all the BS from happening with the manufacturers, they made everybody perform under the exact same parameters. So with the new Federal Trade Commission rules in place, the Pioneer SX1010 was the first audio receiver that was rated at 100 watts RMS per channel. That same year, Marantz, with its model 2325, topped the Pioneer with 125 watts per channel. So this is kind of the start, 74, of the power wars, of the receiver power wars. Both Pioneer and Marantz got off first with this, before Sansui or Kenwood or many of the other manufacturers who came along in the next few years to join into the receiver power war era. After seeing what Pioneer and Marantz did in 1974, the other manufacturers started to come back in 1975 with their own receivers that were rated at 100 watts or more per channel RMS. One was the Sansui 9090, and also Kenwood came out with the KR 9400. So as 1976 started, Pioneer came out with the SX1250. Well, now the SX1250 was going to bring to the table 160 watts per channel, as if to say, here, go ahead guys, beat this one. And along with the Pioneer SX1250 came a new company onto the scene of the receiver wars, the Technics SA5760. Again, a monster receiver, 165 watts per channel. And other ones, like the Rotel RX1603 with 180 watts per channel, showed up in 1976. So everybody was getting in on this power wars at this point. So 1977 rolls around, and Yamaha comes out with their own monster receiver, the CR3020 at 160 watts per channel. Kenwood comes out with their KR 9600, again 160 watts per channel. Then a name most people don't think of when it comes to audio, back then or now, Hitachi with a 200 watt per channel receiver, SR 2004. And then came the Marantz 2500 at a unbelievable 250 watts per channel into 8 ohms and 330 watts per channel into 4 ohms. And this is 1977. This again is only 3 years out from when the receiver power wars started. So there was massive jumps in power through just a very short period of time. But now it's been about 50 years since this receiver has been manufactured, so I knew this was going to be a big project, and I was going to go in there and not only have to repair, but also restore this Marantz 2500. This Marantz 2500 is much lighter than many of the high-powered receivers that were built during this time frame, and most of that has to do with the small heatsink assemblies that they used in the 2500. Along with a fan to help dissipate the heat. So a lot of the weight was reduced there. This unit only weighs about 60 pounds, which is still a lot, but it's not 100 pounds. The engineering of the 2500 was all top-notch, and I'm going to show you ahead how I went ahead, disassembled this entire unit, even has its original power transistors that left Japan almost 50 years ago. I'm going to take it up on the bench after I get done repairing and restoring this unit, making sure it operates to its original specifications as close as it can. And then I'm going to put it into my music system, and I'm going to do what it was made to do, and that's play music. So let's get back to it. I'm going to get back and start showing you the restoration of this amazing Marantz 2500. As I mentioned earlier, the transformer can be a possible issue in some Marantz 2500s, but another issue I had repairing and restoring this 2500 was it was difficult for me to work on. Now remember, I'm not a professional. This is the first 2500 I've ever worked on. I'm strictly a hobbyist. I've taken quite a few of these apart and put them back together, but I'm by no means a professional. So for someone else, maybe that knows what they're doing better, this would be a piece of cake. But for me, this 2500, even though it wasn't the biggest, the heaviest, the most packed in piece of equipment I've ever worked on, everything seemed to be difficult, or at least a lot of it did. And a lot of that had to do with the connectors. On some of the assemblies, they had regular pin connectors. You could remove the connector, and that was easy enough. On others, they were soldered on. On other assemblies, it was a combination of both. And it seemed like no matter what I undid, I had to undo something else to get to it. And it was a little bit odd for me because normally the progression of these pieces of equipment, you take one thing out and you take another thing loose, and you can kind of see how they come apart once you have some experience with them. With this one, it wasn't that way. So I have to say that the mechanical engineer or engineers, which it almost appears like you had 2 or 3 people or 2 or 3 groups that were mechanically putting this unit together, I'm not sure if they couldn't have done a little bit better job. And I think a lot of that just has to do with giving you a little more slack in the wiring. There's not a lot of slack, so you loosen something, and all of a sudden you start to try to remove it, and you've only got an inch or 2. And you're wondering, what the heck is holding you up? And you think, well, it's this connector. So you remove this connector, which is easy enough. You remove a connector off a board, and you got a little more play. Then you take off another connector, a little more play. But you still feel like you're fighting something. And before you know it, you're having to loosen a cable bundle in another section of the receiver to give you enough slack. Any of you guys looking to get a Marantz 2500, or maybe you have one, I just wanted to give you a heads up about what I found when I started tearing into this unit. Just a little bit more difficult to get around than some. Not that you can't do it, but it's just a little bit more crammed in there and a little bit more, in my opinion, haphazard than maybe it needs to be. And you may notice too, in a lot of these pictures, I've marked the cables. You can do that in any manner you want. I also take pictures, obviously, because I do these videos. So I take pictures of what I'm doing, but I also mark these cables, and even with arrows up, because even the cabling, unlike a lot of vintage audio equipment, many of these cables are not keyed, meaning you can put them in wrong. You can put them into the wrong connector. You can put them in upside down. A lot of pieces of equipment, you can't do that. They key them in one way or another. They either have an extra pin, or the connector is keyed in a way where you can't put it in upside down. It's practically impossible. If you do, then you're forcing it. In this unit's case, you can put them in upside down if you're not careful. So, as I mentioned, this was a lot of wiring that's just kind of all over the place. And so I just went ahead and marked them up. Marked which cable it was and which way it was in which direction, because once I started unhooking this stuff and loosening stuff, they get all orientated different. In most units, I don't have to do this. I wouldn't even think about doing this. I wouldn't have to worry, am I going to be able to get it back together again? But it's another precaution, I guess, I've learned from making mistakes in the past, that it's just better, take a little bit extra time, mark them if you need to, which I felt I needed to, you, and you'll end up having a good result in the end. Before I can work on this Marantz 2500 any further, before I could restore or repair it, and the same with you guys, whether you have a Marantz 2500 or another piece of equipment that you want to repair or restore, you need the documentation that will allow you to do that, whether it's a repair or a restoration. HiFiEngine.com is the resource to get owner's manuals, service manuals, old brochures, just about any type of documentation that you would need to either restore or repair vintage audio equipment. All you've got to do is go to HiFiEngine.com, open up a user account, and you're ready to download. There's no charge, and from my experience, they have 99% of the documentation I've ever needed for any piece of vintage audio equipment. The most important document is that service manual for whatever piece of equipment you're working on. Without a service manual, you're not going to have a chance to be able to repair or restore this equipment. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're inexperienced or you're experienced. You need the service manual. But not only the service manuals are on there, as I indicated, there's the original owner's manuals are on there. And that's really nice to have because many of us don't have the original manuals with our equipment. They've gotten thrown away over the years and they're just not there. And also, I mentioned the brochures. These are the same brochures that back in the day when I went to my local stereo shop and I'm there looking around, I walk out of the store. If I don't purchase anything, I walk out of the store at least with some brochures, and they try to talk me into coming back and buying the stuff. So as I said, Hi-Fi Engine's a great resource for anybody who's into vintage audio. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that most of the parts are available for any piece of vintage audio equipment, but I really didn't go into any extra details about that, like, well, where do you get them then, Chris? So let me go ahead here for just a minute and let you know where you can find parts for not only this Marantz 2500, for any piece of vintage audio equipment that you may have. Mouser Electronics and DigiKey Electronics are where I feel you should buy most of your parts from. They'll have 95% of the components that you need to keep your vintage audio equipment running or to restore your vintage audio equipment. Now, things like cosmetic pieces, let's say you're missing a volume control on your receiver. You're not finding it here. You're going to have to go to eBay to get something like that. Transistors, capacitors, resistors, those type of components, a lot of people just think they're going to go to these sites and just find their parts. It's going to take you some time, and it's really not that difficult to find the parts, but there's a lot of choices, and you've got to know which ones to use, and that's the difficult part. So I would suggest that you go to some of these audio forums on the internet, or just do a general search on Google, like Pioneer SX 1980 restoration or something like that, and you'll find some long articles on what people have done, what parts they've used, etc., and that'll help you find what you need. From time to time, I'll get asked for my build list for a project. I work on so many different units that I just keep a stock of parts. And normally, the only thing I won't have are those filter capacitors. Anyway, I don't have a bunch of those sitting around, but the rest of the components I order in quantities of 10, 25, maybe even 100 at a time. You can purchase these quite a bit cheaper if you buy them in bulk from both Mouser and DigiKey. And it's just so convenient to just start a project and have all the parts available. You guys that follow my videos know why I need all these parts, because I go in and I restore every old piece of equipment that I have. I'm a firm believer in getting those old electrolytic capacitors out, getting those other known semiconductors out of there that are known to be bad through the years. There's several transistors that are bad. If you find them, you got to get rid of them or they're going to cause you trouble. There's a few diodes, but the main thing is those electrolytic capacitors. They're all going to fail. And it's not me saying that, it's the manufacturers of those capacitors that say that. And I just ask you all again to please do your research. In today's world, there's really no excuse for you not knowing the truth about electrolytic capacitors. Just Google electrolytic capacitor lifespan and start reading. And you'll find all the manufacturers' websites talking about it. You'll find engineers talking about it. Every single electrolytic capacitor, no matter its quality, it's going to fail someday. You're probably thinking, well, yeah, they're all going to fail. Everything's going to fail eventually. But if you guys don't want to do the research, I understand. I've done a little bit of it. I'm no expert. As you guys can tell, I'm not real bright, and I'm a hobbyist who works on vintage audio equipment. But I can tell you a little bit about them. And the reason that they fail is because of a slow evaporation of the electrolyte that's in these capacitors. Two main issues cause that electrolyte to start to evaporate. And that's a lot of time, and that's a lot of heat. There it is in a nutshell. If you've got an electrolytic capacitor that's been in a very hot environment for a very long time, you've got a better chance of it failing. But generally, and again, to just come down to a conclusion, after about 20 years in a normal environment, you can expect your electrolytic capacitor to operate properly within its specifications and not fail on you. Maybe you'll get really lucky and it'll go 30 or 40. It certainly can happen depending on the capacitor. But keep in mind, every failure is not an explosion. Every failure is not my receiver won't power up. Many times these fail slowly over time. They don't fail spectacularly. And so you may believe that your piece of vintage audio equipment's working great. If it's 30, 40, 50 years old and hasn't had its electrolytic capacitors changed out, it's very unlikely it's operating like it did when it was new. But as I mentioned earlier, this is just something y'all have got to decide on your own. I restore my equipment. You may not want to do it to yours. Am I right? Are you wrong? No. You do what you want to do with your equipment. I do what I want to do with my equipment. So now I'm going to start the restoration process on this Marantz 2500. And as I've just indicated, those electrolytic capacitors that are 50 years old, they're going to be gone. There's also a few transistors, a few diodes that are known troublemakers that will also have to be replaced. But for the most part, this is all about those electrolytic capacitors and getting new fresh ones in there so that this Marantz 2500 can go for another 50 years. Or it'll probably go longer than that. I would not be surprised to see this receiver still operating 100 years from now. Although the service manual has a parts list, the only real way to determine what parts that you need for a restoration is to look at the parts that are in the unit that you have. 95% of the time, the service manual is probably going to be correct. But when you're replacing 100 parts, let's say, in a restoration, something like this one, inevitably, you're going to miss one or two of them. Or the service manual that you have is not accurate for the model that you have. It was built at a different point in time in the production process, and it's not accurate. So just take a look at what you have in your particular unit, then go ahead and order from Mouser or DigiKey, and it'll save you a lot of headaches down the road. So I'm going to show a few details doing this Marantz 2500 that I don't normally show, and this will relate to any piece of vintage audio equipment that you may be restoring. So first of all, I want to show you here in the picture what you're looking at, and this is the preamp and tone amp circuit board. Mounted to that is the balance control along with the filter amp board. So there's really three different assemblies that you're looking at here in the picture. Now, over on the chassis side, you can see where this assembly was removed. And I was able to undo the cables, as I said, a little bit of a pain to get it out. But now I have it out in my hand, and I'm able to deal with it much easier than when it was down in the chassis. Now, here's a picture of the same assemblies in the Marantz 2500, but they're still inside the chassis. Both the pre and the tone amp circuit board, along with the balance control and the filter amp board. So hopefully this helps you understand a little bit looking at your unit. It doesn't have to be a Marantz 2500, doesn't have to be a Marantz at all. If you've got a receiver from this era, anywhere in the 70s, 80s, it's built in a very similar manner. So you look over there at your Onkyo or your Sansui or your Pioneer, your Kenwood, your Yamaha, they're all built in a similar manner. So now I've separated the balance control and the filter amp board from the preamp circuit board. And now I'm able to get to all of the controls on the preamp board easily, as well as being able to get to the connector pins on the filter amp board. So though I was complaining earlier about the cabling, right now I'm saying, hey, this is pretty nice, because now I've got these assemblies just right out here in my hand, and as you can see, it's going to be much easier for me to clean the controls and replace components. All of you guys have either had or heard of having a unit that sound comes and goes, the left channel's scratchy, then it comes back, you move this switch or you move the balance control, it comes, it goes, and almost always it has something to do with a dirty control somewhere in the unit. And after all these years, these units that are 30, 40, 50, 60 years old, they all need to have their controls cleaned. And I happen to use Addict, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about cleaning the controls. I just wanted to talk a minute about the products I use to clean the pots, the switches, and the various different moving parts in a piece of vintage audio equipment. Now I use Addict products. It's easy for you guys to go out there and do your own research. These aren't the only cleaning products available. I've used them for a lot of years. I've never had an issue. Some people will say some of these don't work or they don't work properly or whatever. I'm not a chemist. I'm not an expert on how one particular lubricant may damage a piece of carbon or may damage a piece of plastic or what have you. But I just want to say from practical experience that these products have worked for me. So in this 2500, I'll use the Addict spray for the potentiometers, and I'll use the liquid Addict for things like pins, where you don't need a spray to go all over the place. You just need a little bit of Addict on a pin, and usually using a Q-tip works real well, and you can just wipe the pins that way, and that just works out better. Makes a lot less of a mess. The push button switches in the 2500, it's critical that you clean those well. And not only in a 2500, but any piece of vintage audio equipment. They are just known troublemakers, and they cause all kinds of intermittent issues that take you forever to try to figure out what's going on. So just while you have a unit apart, like I've got this 2500 apart, just take your time and clean those well with some Addict or whatever your favorite cleaning spray is.
Taking this thing apart is really not that difficult, but keep the screws, the washers, etc. in a way that makes sense to you. Me, I kind of line them up. I kind of think ahead, where does this go back? And I don't get too far ahead of myself, so I'm not, at the end thinking, where does all this stuff go?
The reason I bring up the fasteners, things like the screws, the washers, etc., and making sure you kind of keep track of them, I can't tell you how many pieces of equipment I've worked on where screws are missing, washers are missing, some of the screws are missing, some of the washers are missing, and I know what happened. Somebody was working on it, they're taking it apart, they're putting the washers here, they're putting the screws there, they're thinking, I know where these go, I'll figure it out. Well, they get done and they didn't figure it out. All right, I've got the pre and tone amp circuit board finished up, along with the filter amp board. And so now I'm going to move on to the next boards. And these are the phono and selector switchboard and the tape and scope display switchboard. The phono and the mode selector switchboard is located at the bottom left of the chassis in the model 2500. Here you can see in this picture I have the chassis sitting on its side, and I've got that board already removed, and just above that board you can see the tape and scope display switchboard, which I haven't removed yet. If you take a look at this picture down toward the bottom, this is the phono and selector board. You can see there's 10, maybe a dozen wires that are wire wrapped directly onto this board. It also had connectors, several connectors hooked to it, and once again, those were easy enough to pull off. But I do not want to unwrap every single one of these wires and then solder them back on again. So fortunately, I figured out a way to get enough room to work on the board. I wish I had a little bit more, but that's enough for me to get in there and change out the components I need to change. This is what I was talking about earlier, where the unit is not all that easy to work on, in my opinion. Can you work on it? Yeah. Am I working on it? Yes, I am. But it'd been nice if all those were plug-in connectors and I could just unplug it and put it on the bench and work on it a lot easier, but that's not the way this one is. I've removed the tape and scope display board, had no issue getting that out, came right out, and you may be able to see in this picture how there's connectors. And I just had to unplug connectors from those pins and out it came, unlike the phono board I just showed you. So I'm going to go ahead and change the only electrolytic that's on this board and do that. And I'm going to clean, again, these push button switches. They are problematic. Any of these switches can cause you an audio issue down the road. So last thing I want to do is have this all tore apart, get it back together, and then have to tear it apart again. So I'm making some progress here on these last 4 assemblies that I've shown you. I've gone ahead and I've replaced those 50-year-old electrolytic capacitors that needed to go. I'll inspect the artwork and just take a look at things and make sure I don't see anything obvious while I have these assemblies out of the chassis. And people will ask me, well, what electrolytic capacitor should I use? What brand should I use? First of all, brand-wise, just use a quality name. If you like Panasonic, great, use Panasonic. If you like Nichicon, use Nichicon. If you like Elna, use Elna, etc. Just use a name brand capacitor manufacturer and your restoration will turn out great. Now, as far as the values go of capacitors, it goes without saying you should use what you took out. So if you took out 100 microfarad, 100 volt capacitor, you should replace it with that, or a minimum of that voltage. A lot of times I'll have maybe a 10 volt capacitor and I'll move it up to a 25 volt capacitor, but I'll always keep its capacitance value the same. So that you shouldn't change. You can bump up the voltages if you'd like to, and it might be a good idea to. It doesn't hurt, because the higher voltage capacitors and whatever capacitance you're using, they're just a few pennies more. Another item that I use a lot is my desoldering tool, and I've mentioned this before in videos, but if you're going to do a big project like this or work on this equipment often, a desoldering tool is, as far as I'm concerned, is a must. It makes it so much easier to do, and you have so much less risk of damaging any of these boards by using this gun. It'll heat those pins right up, and it'll make a somewhat difficult job pretty easy. As I've mentioned through this video, there's a number of points in the 2500 where they've soldered wires directly to pins. Now this picture shows the speaker switch assemblies, speaker 1 and speaker 2. Now I'm just showing this as an example of, take a look at the soldering points while you have this all apart. You've got to remember, you're bending the stuff back and forth several times, you're putting some stress on it. It's just a good time to find a problem before you put it back together and find out you got a problem. So normally, I would have not worked on as many sections of a project before I put it back together to try it than I've done here on this 2500. And that's because, as I've been saying, it's been a little bit more difficult to get apart. a little bit more difficult to get back together, and then I have to take it all back apart again. So while I had it apart, I just kept taking it apart. And so I've worked on a lot of different assemblies, as I've shown you. At this point, I am going to put it back together because I shouldn't have to get into this area again from underneath the chassis here and to get to the pre and the tone amp boards and the filter amp and the phono amp selector switches and all the different boards that I went through. I should be able to put that back together, and I don't think I'll have to get back down here again unless I find a problem after I get it back together that I caused when I was working on it. And that does happen. It happens not all the time. It happens a little less frequently than it used to. When I first started out, I'm a little bit more careful. And then just give the 2500 a quick test. Make sure I've got both channels. The 2500 checked out just fine, so now I'll continue on with the repair and restoration. Next, I'm going to work on the audio muting board on this Marantz 2500. And this board is situated, if you look from the top with the cover off, on the right-hand side toward the center of the chassis. And on this small assembly, there's an Marantz speaker relay, and that's been in there nearly 50 years now. Is it still operating? It appears to be. In my checking so far, everything seems to operate fine, but I'm going to change it out. It's only about a $15 part. It's been in there nearly 50 years. Why leave it in there? Makes no sense to me. Somebody else might leave it and say, don't worry about it. You know, if it fails, I'll replace it. Well, it's just not the way I do things. If I'm going to go in here and restore it, I'm going to go ahead and do it correctly. And in my opinion, correctly is getting a new relay. And the great thing is the relay is still available. You can order it from either Mouser or DigiKey, easy to get, and there's really no reason not to change it out. Now, I'm going to go ahead and change just the one electrolytic capacitor that's on this audio muting board, and I'm using 105 degrees centigrade rated capacitors, not only in this single capacitor, but in all the capacitors in this project. It just gives you a little bit more of a cushion. After whining about some of the other assemblies and how they were difficult to work on, this guy here was a piece of cake, just held in with a couple screws, so there was no issues with this audio muting board whatsoever as far as getting it in or out of the chassis. The next board I'm going to go after is the regulated power supply, and in any piece of vintage audio equipment, this is probably one of the leading causes of problems in the older equipment, because the power supplies in these pieces of equipment generally run quite warm and they're under a lot of stress. And as I indicated earlier, heat and time is what destroys components, and power supplies generally have a lot of heat, and of course after 50 years or so there's been a lot of time to go by. So that area of any piece of vintage audio equipment, doesn't have to be like this Marantz 2500, usually is a spot that needs attention. As I mentioned earlier, take a bunch of pictures, write down on a piece of paper, mark the cables in some manner though, so you can get this back together before you start unhooking it. The last spot you want to hook up a cable in correctly is in your power supply. So the main thing is, before you start to disassemble any part of your vintage audio equipment, take pictures. Write down on a piece of paper where they go. Mark the cables in some manner that you understand where they go, because this is not an area of any piece of vintage audio equipment that's going to tolerate something hooked up incorrectly. Where Marantz mounted this regulated power supply is a great spot. It's at the top of the chassis. The heat can dissipate off of this assembly and out through the case easily. Unlike my Pioneer SX1980, where the regulated power supply for that monster receiver is mounted at the bottom of the chassis. And Pioneer SX 1980s are known to have issues with their power supplies. And that's one of the main reasons why, because in Pioneer's case, they decided to put it at the bottom of the chassis, and the heat just cannot get out of there, and it bakes itself over a period of years. Now in this 2500 though, the power supply is in an ideal position at the top of the chassis, and so that heat can rise and get out of the chassis easily. So another thing I like about this power supply is that it easily comes out of the chassis. All the wiring was connectors, so I just had to pull the connectors and loosen the board, and I've got it right in front of me. So it's going to make it a piece of cake to get in there and change out those old electrolytic capacitors. And in my case, I'm using Nichikan PW series capacitors in this power supply. As I indicated earlier, that's not saying there aren't many other ones you could use that would work just as well, but that's what I'm using in this particular power supply. I'm also changing out the transistor regulators. And again, you're saying, well, why are you doing that? Well, there's nothing wrong with the power supply that I know of, other than it's almost 50 years old. And while I'm in here for just a few dollars, I can get some modern equivalent regulators. In my case, I'm using onsemi MJE 15032 regulator transistors. They got a great reputation. There's a very good chance they're going to last forever in this unit. And while I'm in there, I'm going to do that. And at the same time, I'll change out the transistor insulator. I'll put a new insulator in there, and I'll also clean up the heat sink, and I'll apply some new thermal compound. Again, is any of this 100% necessary? Maybe not, but it's the way I do things. It's the way I restore my equipment. I'm going to do everything I can possibly do to make this unit reliable for the next 50 years. Some of you guys may have noticed in this picture that some of these capacitors are rated up to 350 volts, but that's all about the oscilloscope, nothing else. So the only reason these capacitors are rated as high as they are, some of them, is for the oscilloscope, which is an unusual feature in this Marantz 2500. Whenever I've done some work, like on this power supply assembly, where I've changed out several capacitors along with some transistors, I take a look at my work before I reinstall it. Sometimes you find issues. Sometimes I have a solder joint that I didn't do well. Sometimes I find an issue I could have found just by taking a look. Everything looked good, so I went ahead and reinstalled the power supply back into the chassis, and now all I have to do is hook the cables back up and give it a try. I powered the 2500 back up, no issues at all, so now I'll continue on. So I've made a lot of progress with this restoration. I'm getting closer to being able to show you how this Marantz performs on the test bench, along with some surprises. As big as this one. Now, did you hear that? But first, I want to talk a little bit more about the history of the Marantz Corporation. Sol Marantz had a dream to create the highest quality audio products, and that is exactly what he did. Sol B. Marantz, perhaps the man most responsible for the birth of a high-end audio industry, was born the oldest of 3 children on July 7, 1911 in New York City. He received art training with courses at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. After his formal training, he became a commercial artist, serving clients such as Hayes and General Electric. He met his future wife, Jean Dickey, in New York City at a St. Patrick's Day party in 1939. Jean was to play a pivotal role in bringing the name Marantz to the public's attention in years to come. Sol joined the Army Transportation Service in the spring of 1943 as a civilian employee. During his employment with the Army Transportation Services, Sol earned his GED, and though he was technically a civilian, rose to a rank of major. After the war, Sol and Jean lived in Woodside, a suburb in the borough of Queens, New York City, and later moved to Kew Gardens, another Queens neighborhood. Sol Marantz's musical interest blossomed in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The arrival of the first long-playing microgroove record, spinning at 33 1/3 revolutions in 1948, and general post-war prosperity contributed to the rising interest in high-fidelity equipment. Among many other companies, Macintosh, Fisher, and H.H. Scott, they began to manufacture components. Sol Marantz, however, was not satisfied with the commercially available components of his day, and he began to build his own. His wife's proficiency with calculus proved invaluable to Sol as he readied the audio consolette, his first product. Jean's ability at solving complex equations allowed her to calculate the proper values for many of its internal circuit components. In the early 1950s, Sidney Smith came on board as an engineer at Marantz and would be responsible for a large part of Marantz's success in the early years of audio, including the 10B tuner. It's interesting that neither he or Sol Marantz had electrical engineering degrees. Mr. Marantz's formal education was in graphic arts. He was largely self-taught in electronics. Mr. Smith had some radar training in World War II. That was how he was exposed to electronics. Interesting also that Dick Sikora, another person credited with much of the RF design of the 10B, and also being considered as one of the greats when it comes to tuner design for his work at his own company years later, didn't have an EE either. But he did have RF experience as he worked at Pilot Radio before he came to Marantz. There were other people like Mitch Cotter, hired as a consulting engineer for the 10B project, but the main core of the 10B engineering group were not formally educated in electronics. That was something that could happen in the 1950s or 1960s, but no way it would happen in today's world. I obtained the information about the Marantz Corporation and the Marantz 10B tuner that you just heard from two different publications on the internet. My presentation was only a small part of the information that's available. One of the publications is Vacuum Tube Valley, issue number 5, that was published in the fall of 1996. This publication can be found by searching worldradiohistory.com. In that issue, many of the people that were part of the original Marantz 10B project were interviewed. Each spoke in their own words about their contribution, as well as others who contributed to the 10B's tuner's development. It really is a great read for those of you who want to hear the 10B's real story and not a load of BS that you so often find in the forums on the internet. The other publication can be found at audiohistory.com. Here the family of Sol Marantz is interviewed, including his daughter June. There's no better source of information about a person than hearing it from other family members. Again, a great read for anybody looking for genuine and accurate information about Mr. Marantz and his company. As I mentioned, I find the company's history very interesting, and I talked a little bit here about my 10B tuner because this was the product that really caused Marantz to sell the company to Superscope in 1964. When this 10B tuner came out in 1963, it retailed for $650. That's a crazy amount of money. It's still a decent amount of money in today's world, $650, but back then you could get yourself a real nice car for that. As Mr. Marantz sold his company in 1964 to Superscope, he really didn't have anything to do with the Marantz 2500 in the late 70s. But I do find it interesting they both had oscilloscopes, because oscilloscopes have never been something that was common in commercial audio equipment. Now I'm going to get back to the restoration of this Marantz 2500, and now I'm going to go after the peak indicator and the soft start circuit board, and that sits on the right side of the chassis near the rear. So once again, take some pictures or mark the connectors before you remove them. from the board, so you can get it back together again if there's any question. This board's just like the other boards. It's got those old electrolytic capacitors in there that I'm going to change out. And in this board's case, it's got a diode that over the years is a known troublemaker, not just in a Marantz 2500 or not just in Marantz products in general, but in vintage audio equipment. And this diode was used in many other brands, Pioneer, Sansui, Kenwood, etc. So if you see these diodes, they need to be changed out. These diodes have a forward voltage drop that's between 1.25 and 1.35 volts. So what you can use most of the time as a replacement, seeing that you cannot get the exact replacement anymore, is to do what I did. And I used two 1N4148 diodes in series. And you just go ahead, put those in series, put them in as a replacement, and you'll probably never have an issue with these diodes ever again. After getting the components changed out, I went ahead, just like I did on the other assemblies, hooked it back up and gave it a try. Everything seemed to be working fine, so on I go. Now I'm going to work on the main amp section of this Marantz 2500, and this consists of two individual boards. One's the left channel, one's the right channel, and they're each mounted on to the heatsink tunnel. And these are a little bit harder to see. The right channel is pretty easy to see. Here with the case off, you can see it's mounted here on the side. Now the left channel is kind of down in the chassis and you can't see it very well while it's still mounted in the chassis. And you can see it here going down the left side of this tunnel. Here's a picture looking down from the top of the Marantz 2500, and you can see toward the back of this picture this heatsink tunnel. And a little bit more of a close-up, you can see the heat sinks that the power transistors are hooked to inside of this tunnel. Now it goes without saying, make sure you take pictures before you unhook the assembly. Make sure that you write down on a piece of paper or that you mark the cables before you unhook this assembly. And once you do that, this is another one of those assemblies from the top that just pulls straight on out. There's just several screws that you have to undo, and once those screws are removed, the whole assembly comes out. The heatsink tunnel along with the left and right power amp assemblies. With the tunnel assembly removed, if you look down from the top, you can see where the power transistors are all mounted inside of this tunnel. So what you have is the power transistors on the inside of this tunnel hooked to their heat sinks, and then you have the left and right channel power amp assemblies mounted to the outside of this tunnel. In this picture, you can see the fan that was mounted to the power transistor tunnel. And this is necessary in this unit because the power transistors are not mounted onto big, large heat sinks like they are in some big receivers of this era. So this fan was necessary to keep them cool. And whenever you have a fan in any piece of equipment, dust and dirt is just going to collect. How that happens, I'm not exactly sure. You think moving air all the time, that wouldn't happen, but just think your ceiling fan in your house. Turn it off and look at all the dirt and dust that collects on it. With air moving, you wouldn't think that would happen, but it surely does. Both power amp assemblies come off of this heatsink tunnel easily. Again, it was great. All I had to do is undo a few screws, and it pulls right off of 3 different connectors. So it was a piece of cake, and again, I was able to place the board right in front of me. Makes it so much easier to work on, and I can go in there and change out those old electrolytic capacitors. And again, as I reminded you earlier, pick the ones that you want. Just pick a good quality capacitor, and it's going to be better than those 50-year-old ones that are in your piece of vintage audio equipment. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to take the tunnel apart so I can access the power transistors, where they're mounted. And after decades, as I indicated before, showing you some of those pictures, a lot of dirt and dust is collected. Again, there's a fan hook to this, and you would think the fan would keep stuff moving, but for some reason, they always collect dust in different places. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and get all those decades of dirt and dust cleaned up. These are the original power transistors that left Japan almost 50 years ago. And so get in there, clean those up, and have them run cool so they'll hopefully run for another 50 years. And the same thing with the heat sinks themselves. There's just decades of crud on them that need to be cleaned up. And along with that is the heat sink tunnel itself. This picture shows where the power transistors are mounted against the heat sink. Get in there and clean all that stuff up. One thing about this unit, which is a little bit unusual, is that the power transistors are not mounted in sockets. Many times you just have to loosen a couple screws and they'll come right on out for you. In this unit, it's not that way. You have to unsolder the base and the emitter to be able to remove these power transistors. And this is where that Hacko desoldering tool, I can't tell you how much of a help it is with this particular issue, because these solder points are pretty big. And you could use solder wick, or you could try to remove it in some other manner. But boy, what a pain in the butt it would be. And I'm so glad I have the desoldering tool to help me with that. As I mentioned, these are the original power transistors that came with this Marantz 2500 almost 50 years ago. So I want to do everything I can to make sure that these continue to operate properly. And so I'll go in there and I'll clean up the cases. As most of you know, when you're looking at a power transistor, really what I'm holding here in my hand is the case. The transistor's inside this case, but I'll clean that case up so it can transmit heat better. And what I'll use is just some alcohol, get that old thermal compound off there, and make them look pretty much just like brand new. What I'll do is install new mica insulators. These are just a few pennies a piece. They don't cost very much. Some new thermal compound, I'll apply that to them, and these will be good to go for another 50 years. So you can see how nice these heat sinks clean up. This was just with some soap and water, nothing more than that. So now with everything cleaned up, I can start to reassemble everything back into the tunnel. I can put those power transistors as well as the heat sinks back in, along with the new mica insulators and the new thermal compound. What I also did at the same time that I reseated the power transistors, what I did is I replaced the driver transistors that are also mounted in this tunnel. Are the old ones working? Yes, they are. But they've been in there a long time, and I didn't want to have to get back in there down the line. So fortunately, in today's world, there's some great equivalent transistors that work wonderfully for these drivers. And these are the onsemi MJE 15032 and 15033 drivers. And they work wonderful in any vintage piece of equipment. So I went ahead and I changed those out. Again, new mica insulators, new thermal compound. So now, as I mentioned, now it's putting it back together. And it takes a little bit of time to get all 16 back in there. And actually, you do one channel at a time. Here I'm showing like one of them completed. This is just one half of the assembly. And there's another half that is shown here in this picture that I haven't started yet. You can see it's all dirty on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, it looks all cleaned up because it is. So I've got to go ahead. I've got 8 out of the 16 power transistors reseated and the tunnel cleaned up and the drivers changed out. Now I've just got to do it on the other side. And I'll go ahead and do that. And of course, on that other side, you've got the other power amplifier assembly that I've got to get in there and change out the old electrolytic capacitors and go in and clean up the heat sinks, just like I did on the other side. So I just have to go in and repeat myself. When I first took this assembly apart, I mentioned connectors, how the power amplifiers assemblies were just plugged in to the tunnel assembly, which was really nice for working on and changing components. But it also gives me an opportunity to clean the pins with deoxit. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then I finished both assemblies. And I show them here. They're all ready to go. I'll put them back together. And most likely, these will go another 50 years. And I think it's just great to be able to have the original power transistors from 50 years ago still operating. So I'm going to go ahead and get this back together. I've got everything reassembled. I went ahead and attached the two pieces of the tunnel back together. I also attached the left and the right power amplifier boards to the tunnel. So it's all back together and it's all ready to put back in the chassis. While it was out of the chassis, of course, I cleaned that up. I'll probably never get in there again, so I took a rag and made sure I wiped everything up down in there pretty good. So I think we're ready to go. I think I'm ready to give it a shot, and let's see if it's still working. I hooked the tunnel assembly back up into the chassis of the 2500 using the pictures I had taken before I'd taken it apart. And I went ahead and I powered it up, and everything seemed to be fine. I just let it sit there for a few minutes. I made sure both the left and the right channels were working because that's what I'd worked on. I'd worked on an assembly that could affect either both or one or the other channels. So I went ahead and just let it sit there on the bench for a little bit and made sure everything was working. So it was, so now I'll continue on. I knew from the initial power up the 2500 that the fan was very loud. I didn't know how loud it was supposed to be, but I did know it was louder than it should be. And I knew at some point I'd have to take care of that, so I just figured, I've got other things to do, and I'll get to it. Well, I've just about got to that point where I've got to do something with the fan. And what I decided to do is just replace it. I thought about taking it out, cleaning it up, taking it apart, and again, I came back to it's decades old. Why do that? Why not just replace it with a new one? So that's what I went ahead and did. And the new one is much quieter than the old one that was in there. Another issue I had initially when I first powered up this 2500, I had a hum from the phono section. As I tell you guys, what you should always do, as what I did with this unit, I knew nothing about it. So when I got the unit, I always take a look at it. Just physically take a look. Take the top cover off, take the bottom cover off, just look with my eyes first. But after that, I power up the unit, normally with a Variac like I did with this unit. And then once it's powered up, I want to know what works and doesn't work before I start working on it. Because years ago, I might take a unit and just real quick power it up. Oh, it works. And then I start working on it. And then down the line, I find out I did something to break it. So I want to know what's working and what's not. So what I did with this unit is I tried the FM and the AM tuner. They seem to work. Both channels seem to work. And then I went ahead and tried a CD player in the auxiliary port, and that seemed to work. Again, both channels seemed to sound fine. Then I hooked a turntable up, and I had a loud hum. Very similar to what you would have if you didn't have a ground hooked to your turntable from your receiver. You had just this hum. And so I knew at that point something was up. I didn't know what was up, but I went ahead and started the restoration and figured I would go through the phono section. I was going to go in there and recap it and everything. So I figured I'll get to that when I get to it. And this way, though, I knew what was working and what wasn't. So I didn't get done with the phono section and then say, what's this hum? Did I have it to begin with? You wouldn't know. So I did know I had a problem right from the first time I tested this 2500. And needless to say, I still had the same problem after I had worked on the phono amp and selector switchboard that I showed you earlier in the video. So I had another problem, and that was something I was going to have to troubleshoot to try to figure out what was going on with that. What I'm going to do now is explain to you how I go about troubleshooting a piece of equipment, and hopefully this is going to help you repair your piece of equipment. Now, I see a lot of folks on YouTube that are very smart people, much smarter than me, going through and explaining how a circuit works. And that's great. But for most people, they're just trying to keep their piece of equipment working or repairing their piece of equipment. And unfortunately, in today's world, it's hard to find anybody to work on the equipment. And a lot of times, you're the one that's going to have to fix it. And it's unlikely that my problem with this phono section in this Marantz 2500 is going to be your problem with your piece of equipment. So I like to show in my videos, like I'm going to show in this one, the practical way that most people need to approach a problem with their piece of vintage audio equipment, because most of us, including me, we're not experts. This isn't what we did for a career. We just don't have, as I mentioned, the expertise out there anymore. Everybody's getting old, everybody's retiring, the old technicians are dying, and many times people are left on their own. So I want to show you in practical terms how you may be able to repair your piece of equipment. You may not be able to, but I think this does a lot more to keep the vintage audio equipment going by me giving you generalities about how to repair a piece of equipment than me taking you through a section like my phono section, point after point after point after point, and then showing you what happened, why it happened, and what components I changed to fix the problem. Because the odds of this being your problem are 1 in a million. But me showing you in general how to approach any problem that you may have with your vintage piece of audio equipment, I think can be valuable. As I said before, the first thing, take a look at the piece of equipment that you're working on with your eyes and see if you can see anything. Then test it out. Test it out in every way that you can possibly can. Test it out with a CD player. Test it out with a turntable. See what's working and see what's not. The next step is for you to go to HiFiEngine.com and open an account if you don't already have one, and download for free the service manuals, the owner's manuals for whatever piece of equipment that you're going to be working on. What you also need is a digital multimeter, and this will allow you to troubleshoot a lot of different issues. There may be a point where you need an oscilloscope to troubleshoot a problem, and that's even nicer to have. With an oscilloscope and with a multimeter, you can fix pretty near 100% of the issues with vintage audio equipment. With just a digital multimeter, you can probably fix more than half the issues that you're ever going to run into. So let's get started into how you approach a problem in a piece of vintage audio equipment. And we're going to use the problem I'm having with my Marantz 2500 as an example. But as I indicated, this could be any problem in any piece of vintage audio equipment, and I would go about approaching it the same way. So I have a hum in my phono section, and I know it was there originally because I tested out everything, and I had it before I did all this work on it, all the restoration work, changing out the old components. I knew I had a hum. So now I have to go back and figure out what that hum is being caused by. So I was thinking, oh no, I don't want to get back into that phono amp and selector switchboard. If you guys saw earlier in the video, that was a difficult one to work on because of the cabling situation. So I was thinking, how am I going to do this? So many times you can think about the easiest thing to do. And the easiest thing for me to do was to check the voltage coming from the regulated power supply to the phono amp. And I saw in the schematic that was in the service manual that I tell you guys you should download that this circuit uses plus 31 volts and minus 31 volts. I was able to get to the regulated power supply side easily. I showed you guys earlier how easy that particular assembly was to work on. It's mounted right at the top. Pull out a few cables, pull out a few screws, and you can pull it right out. You can see here in the photo that J805 supplies the plus and minus 31 volts to the phono amp and selector switchboard. And that was easy to get at. It's right at the top of the chassis. So I didn't really expect this necessarily to tell me anything other than I knew I had the voltage going to the board. And that's something you should always check first, is to make sure you've got the voltage correct. So I measured, and I had minus 31 volts. Actually, I had about minus 32 volts. That's fine. As I've indicated before, schematic's not going to be perfect. So then I went over to the plus 31 lead, and it was about 40 volts. So that was too far off. And that told me right there, there's something going on with the power supply. It's the regulated power supply. I didn't know that was going to fix the hum, but I knew that was a problem. That was too far off, especially seeing minus 31 was about minus 32, which is what you'd expect. But plus 31, if it was plus 32, that'd be fine. But it was around 40 volts. And I knew that wasn't fine. So finding out that I have an issue with the voltage really narrows down where this problem can be. As I said, it's got to be on that P800 power supply. And I can't tell you how many people get a hold of me and they say, well, how do you figure this stuff out? I look at it, I take the cover off, and I don't even know where to start. This is how you do it. You can narrow it down many times to a particular board or a particular section. And then suddenly it's not so daunting, right? You look and you think, I don't know even where to start. I know where to start now. And this is the same way that you can troubleshoot your problem. And then suddenly it didn't fix your problem, but at least you know what board it's on. And this eliminated 90% of the rest of the unit. And that makes you feel good that now maybe you've got a chance to fix it because you've diagnosed the problem, you know where the problem is, and then you can get in there and try to fix it. Pieces of audio equipment like this Marantz 2500, they were made to last for years, and they were made to be repaired. But this was long before the internet, and the manufacturers had to provide documentation to the service centers so this equipment could be repaired. And what they did is to mark up their schematics. I wouldn't have known I needed plus and minus 31 volts to my phono section. I would have had no idea. I wouldn't know if I needed 10 volts or 50. But it told me 31 volts, and this allowed me to measure that and say, this is not correct. The rest of the schematic is marked up also. You notice that they have Q symbols for transistors. They show C's for capacitors, R for resistors, etc. And they show you different voltages at different points. So you don't have to know exactly how this works. And they understood that not everybody's going to be able to look at this schematic and know how this works. And frankly, most people aren't. So I was able to trace back in the power supply where my issue was with my voltage problem, and it was a bad transistor. And that made sense to me because I changed all the electrolytic capacitors, so I was pretty confident those were good. Resistors don't go bad very often, so it made me think about the transistors. And what I used to test them with was an Atlas DCA Pro that I have. Now, by no means do you need one of these to find a bad transistor. You don't. That multimeter that I told you that you need, a digital multimeter, that would find this problem just as easily. A reason I use this Atlas DCA Pro mostly is for gain matching transistors. And I did do some gain matching of transistors in this particular unit. You really should still gain match any replacement transistors that you replace in the audio path. So I had my 31 volts now. Instead of around 40, I went ahead and hooked a turntable up, gave it a shot, and what do you know? Sounded great. No hum whatsoever, so I'm glad to put that behind me. So I think I've got everything pretty well tweaked with the 2500. I think everything's working properly. And then I go and I use the mode switch. Do you know the mode switch? It's the one I never use. And I just told you guys, before you get into a project, make sure you know what's working and what's not working. Well, the mode switch is that switch that has 5 different positions on it. Stereo, which is the way I always use it. Reverse, I guess that's used if you hook your speakers up backwards and you're too lazy to reverse them back. Then you've got left and right, which mixes the left and the right channels together. Then you've got the left channel only and the right channel only. What are you going to use that for? I've never used anything but stereo, and this kind of proves it, because I went to use that switch. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And I'm going, no, 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 no. How can this not work? Frankly, I wouldn't have known if it would ever worked anyway, because as I said, I've never used a mode switch on any piece of equipment I have. Back when this receiver was produced, a lot of the receivers had this. And I don't even know why. I really don't know why they had it, but they had it. And I've always left mine in stereo and was able to figure out what the left channel was and what the right channel was, and got my speakers hooked up right, so I never touched it. So now I am thinking, oh no, because I've got to go back where? I've got to go back to that phono amp and selector switchboard, which is a pain in the butt to get to. Well, I can whine all I want, but now I've got to take it apart again. And that's how it goes. And just as I told you guys, make sure y'all know now what's working and what's not. And what do? This is a problem I'm sure that was there from the beginning, but I didn't check it out close enough. So now I pay the price, and I'm going to have to go back in there and fix it, because I can't leave it like that. It would bother me to know something's up with it, and I just ignored it. So I've got it apart again, and in my hand is the mode selector switch that I removed from the phono amp and the switch selector board. And my issue is there's a metal shaft that should go through this switch, and I'm showing you this hole from the back side of the switch, and I don't have that little metal piece. What that little metal piece does is moves this switch assembly to different contact points. So here in this picture kind of shows a little white wheel looking thing there in the middle with kind of a rectangular opening, and this shaft should be press fitted into there, and there's no shaft, there's no piece of metal. So when I turn the knob in the front, nothing happens. And what should happen is these different contact points are met, and then you either have stereo, reverse stereo, left and right, or left and right by itself. I've got to find a solution for that, because that's not like something I've got that I can just pull out of my toolbox. As it turned out, it was something I could pull out of my toolbox. I thought about, what can I use here? And a 1.5 millimeter hex wrench just about fit in there right. I had to press it pretty good, but that was good. I wanted it to be tight because I didn't have this particular part, and I wasn't going to probably be able to find one. So I went out to the garage and I cut an old hex wrench, cut a piece off of it, and I brought it back in and I fit it into the switch. It's not exactly right. I'd much rather have what I'm supposed to have in there. I could turn the knob and the switch would operate. So that's what I'm going to go with here, because I don't have any other choice. I don't have a whole switch assembly, and as I said, I don't have the parts for the switch assembly either. So, but that's a good enough solution for me. At least I know what happened. Now what happened, I don't know. Why is it missing? So maybe if the unit was handled rough, or maybe over the years it just fell out somehow, which I kind of doubt, but I don't know. I've never saw it when I originally looked over the unit. I don't see it now. I looked again, and this little metal piece you think would rattle around a little bit, and if I shook the chassis around, if it was in there somewhere, I'd find it. So I can't tell you if it was ever there and initially lost it, or if it was never there. But all I know is I don't have one now, and this was a solution I used. I made my own little shaft, and I think that'll work out okay. So now I'll go ahead and resolder the mode switch back into the phono amp and the switch selector board and make sure that's working. Well, getting closer to bench testing this 2500, but first I'm going to go ahead and test out all the various features and make sure that everything's working. As you just saw, sometimes things can come up at the end that you don't expect. So I'm going to go through everything, make sure it's operating properly, and then I'll get to the bench testing. The 2500 is unique because it has an oscilloscope built into it. Many of you guys who have either FM tuners or a receiver that has FM, AM built into it, you have a signal strength meter, and some of you have 2 meters. Another meter for accurately tuning the center of the station. But in this unit's case, you've got an oscilloscope. Is that a little bit over the top? Maybe, but it does have some advantages. First of all, you have a button on the display which is called tuning. And what that does is basically show you the same thing that your signal strength and your center tuning meter would show you in a conventional tuner. So when you get off a little bit left or right of the station, it shows you on the display with a trace that it's a little bit off. So the idea is to get the maximum signal strength and to get the station centered. The exact same way that you do it with your meters, no difference whatsoever. Then you have a multipath button on the front of this 2500, and that may be the most useful feature because that would accurately allow you to get your antenna alignment correct. Back in the day, I could remember trying to draw in stations from 100 miles away, 150 miles away. This is helpful if you're out there trying to adjust your outdoor antenna. Are many of you guys doing that today? Probably not, but back in the day it would have been quite useful. And then you have another button on the front called Scope Audio. And that button there, what you'll see if you push it, when you have a stereo program, you're able to see the stereo separation and the modulation of the signal. Now, does that have a purpose? I don't know that it does. It looks kind of cool. In certain music, it looks very cool. You can get some very interesting displays on your scope. But for the most part, that is just eye candy, and it doesn't do anything really for you. I went over the oscilloscope a little bit more in detail in this 2500 because that was a pretty unusual feature in a piece of vintage audio gear, or in a piece of gear today, probably even more so. The rest of the 2500 was pretty conventional by 1970s standards, especially in a high-end receiver like this. You had AM, FM, 2 phono inputs on auxiliary. It would support 2 tape decks. It had a good range of tone controls. It had a high and low filter, loudness button, FM muting. It supported 2 speaker systems. The 2500 does have one unique, or maybe not unique, it's not the only receiver amplifier who has this, but it has peak indicators. And in Marantz's case, they built a circuit that was designed to follow the variations in the power supply and by load impedance. And supposedly, that was supposed to give you a more accurate indication of when this receiver is actually clipping. I've never seen these indicators light up, and I don't think most people will, not when you've got 250 watts of channel into 8 ohms and 330 into 4 ohms. Here I'm showing you the rear panel of the 2500, and up at the top left you can see where it supports 2 speaker systems. Just to the right is the AM antenna. Down below the speaker systems is that new fan I'd put in to the power transistor tunnel. Next to that is the AC outlets. There's 2 of those. Right under the AM antenna toward the top, there's a muting level adjustment, and that's for your FM. Then next to the muting level, there are 2 controls, one labeled focus, one labeled bright. Now that's not what you'd normally see on the back of any piece of vintage audio equipment. And what those have to do with are that oscilloscope. And so this is where you adjust the focus and the brightness of the oscilloscope. And it's pretty straightforward. There's actually a procedure in the service manual for it. But if you turn those adjustments, even without following the service manual, and you look at the oscilloscope in the front, when you turn the focus, you certainly can see it come in focus and go out of focus, and same with the brightness control. You can see it getting dimmer or brighter, so you can adjust those however you'd like. Below that is the external AM and FM antenna connections. That's just conventional, like any receiver would have. Below that, you have your RCA input for your phono and your auxiliary and your tape monitors. It also has a main in and pre-out RCA jacks. Now, this is a little bit different than the earlier Marantzes. You guys that have earlier Marantzes have a jumper that goes between your main in and your pre-out. If you don't have that jumper in, you don't have any sound. But in this unit, it only breaks the connection if you plug an RCA cable in. So you don't need those jumpers in this 2500. At the top right, you see a Dolby FM decoder receptacle. There's just kind of a hole, and you could purchase a board from Marantz, and then you would be able to listen to Dolby FM broadcasts. Dolby FM just didn't take off like it did in tape decks. Tape decks, it became a standard, but with FM, it just never caught on, even though it sounds like a good idea to help reduce the noise in an FM broadcast, but it just didn't happen. One more thing to add about Dolby FM. If you look at the selector knob on the 2500, there's two possible FM selections. There's FM and then FM 25 microseconds. 25 microseconds, that's the one you would use with Dolby FM broadcasts. And in today's world, there is no Dolby FM, so you would always just select the FM position. And in addition, you would need the decoder in this 2500 for it to operate. I've gone over most of the features of the 2500 and highlighting the unique features of this particular receiver, like the oscilloscope. But these items are things that you can see on the outside. Now I'd like to highlight a couple features of this receiver that are on the inside that you don't even know that exist. There are two thermostats in the 2500 attached to the power transistor tunnel that I showed earlier that I rebuilt, and I put a new fan in. And this fan draws air through the heat sink tunnel. It is controlled by a thermostat. Normally, it will just run on low, and it's very quiet. You get away from the unit just a few feet, you can't even hear it. And if you're playing music, you're not going to hear it at all. And matter of fact, I've never heard it kick on to high playing music. So it's a 2-speed fan. It's either going to run low or it's going to run at a higher speed. And the only time I've ever heard it go to the higher speed is on the test bench, and I'm going to show you that in a little bit. So the heatsink tunnel has to go beyond getting warm. It has to get very hot before the fan kicks into the high mode. The second thermostat is activated at even a higher temperature, and what that does is disconnect your speakers from the output transistors. And what the higher temperature is, I really don't know, but it's something higher than what the fan on high speed can handle. And I've got to tell you this part from the service manual before I get to the bench testing, is it's got to be extreme, because in the service manual, and when I read this, I thought this was insanity. They talk about running a continuous sine wave, which is what you do on the test bench, at 330 watts a channel into 4 ohms. And you think, all right, well, that's what it's rated at. That's what it should do. The testing period's 45 minutes. 45 minutes? I mean, when I read that, I thought that was insanity. I mean, I don't care if this is 1977, but this just shows you the quality, the engineering that went into this. There is no program material you can play that even comes close to a sine wave running at maximum power through this receiver. This isn't even going to shut the amplifier off. I don't know what is going to, but This is part of the testing that you can do with this particular receiver. I just, when I read that, my jaw about dropped, because there's no way I'm doing 45 minutes at 330 watts a channel into 4 ohms. I also own a Pioneer SX 1980, which is a monster receiver in its own right, and it was produced in the same time frame that this Marantz 2500 was. And I'll just want to bring up some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these receivers. Earlier in the video, when I was rebuilding the regulated power supply in the Marantz 2500, I talked about my Pioneer SX 1980 and how the regulated power supply was mounted at the bottom of the chassis. And here I show you where this is mounted. And you can see how in this 1980 that power supply could get very warm. And as the years have gone on, many SX 1980s have had power supply issues, and most people think it's from just cooking itself to death, literally. Being at the bottom of the chassis, there's just no way for that heat to be able to get out of the SX 1980. So Marantz's positioning of the regulated power supply of the 2500 allowed it to be able to get the heat out of the chassis much easier, being mounted at the top. And speaking of the power supply, as I mentioned earlier in the 2500's restoration, there's been a number of reports of having power transformer failures in both the 2500 and 2600. As far as the Pioneer SX 1980 goes, there's been none of that. I'm not saying one has never failed, but there were many more SX 1980s manufactured than there were 2500s, and there's really no reports of the power transformers going bad in them. So there seems to be a little bit more of an issue in the 2500 as far as the power transformer compared to the SX 1980. Both of these receivers are first class, top notch, both in the engineering and the manufacturing. But I wanted to bring up just a couple issues with both of these units that have popped up over 50 years. Gee, what a surprise. And probably going to be more issues when somebody's talking about their SX 1980 or their Marantz 2500 in another 50 years when they're 100 years old. And I wouldn't be surprised if both of these units aren't still operating at that time. I want to compare some of the features of each receiver, and I'm going to start with the tuners. And you saw earlier with the 2500's oscilloscope how that can be a benefit to getting the best signal and the best quality signal when you're listening to radio. Now the Pioneer takes on a different approach, a very sophisticated approach. It takes on an approach where, in my SX 1980's case, some of them didn't have this. This is a later one. This was built in 1980. It has a quartz lock feature. And when you touch the tuning knob, which by the way weighs about 3 pounds, right? This machined aluminum knob, you'll see 3 LEDs. And these indicator LEDs, which are fine-tuned, quartz lock, and stereo. And when you touch the tuning knob, these turn on and off when you get near a station. And so you get near to where you're tuning it in, and when you get close, the fine tune will come on, and if it's a stereo signal, the stereo LED will come on, and then you can release it, and then you'll get the quartz lock. And that makes sure it's dead on. Different than the 2500, right? The 2500 is kind of like for a tinkerer like me. I'd be out there trying to turn my antenna, trying to get the best signal to see what the scope said. I think I would have liked a 2500 back in the day. I couldn't afford one then, but I would have liked one just to mess around with, where the SX 1980 is pretty foolproof. Look, get it close. We'll light some LEDs up for you, let it go, and go sit down and just know that you are getting the best reception that you can possibly get. Look, I get that nobody listens to FM. It doesn't matter to me. I enjoy the stuff. I enjoy reading about it. I enjoy making sure it works correctly. Do I listen to FM? hardly at all. I'll turn on like a piece of equipment like this and just let it warm up with some FM or something. But there are no good FM stations in my area anymore, and I think that's probably holds true for most of the country. But I just love going back, making sure everything works properly, and I guess kind of reminiscing and thinking about what it would have been like to own this piece of equipment back when I was a teenager or a young adult. I'm not going to go through every input difference between the two receivers, but the tuner sections were quite a bit different, so I wanted to do that. And one other area is the phono section. They both support two turntables. You've got a Phono 1 and a Phono 2 on both the 2500 and the 1980. The difference is the Pioneer, you have two front panel selectors to be able to select the load for whatever cartridge you're using. The Marantz 2500 has a fixed load. In the 2500, the phono input impedance is a fixed 47,000 ohms, along with 100 picofarads of capacitance. When you hook a turntable up to your 2500, that is going to be the load that cartridge is going to see. And in most cartridges cases, that's fine. But the SX1980 gives you 3 different resistance levels: 10,000 ohm, 50,000 ohm, and 100,000 ohm, along with 4 different capacitances: 100 picofarad, 200 picofarad, 300 picofarad, and 400 picofarad. Is that going to make a difference? It could in some cartridges, but most cartridges are going to be perfectly happy with something around 50,000 ohms and 100 picofarads. I have a couple Shure V15 cartridges that sound great with a Marantz 2500, so in my case, not having that flexibility to be able to change the impedance or the capacitance really doesn't bother me any. Now, I do have a couple moving coil cartridges also. Neither one of these receivers support moving coil. Both of these receivers are monster receivers. The 2500's rated at 250 watts per channel, and the SX1980's rated at 270 watts per channel. And they go about producing their power in a similar manner in some aspects, using the technology of the day in the late 1970s. They use the same general designs, but they both had the same issue, and that was dissipating heat. And as you saw earlier, Marantz took the approach of having a small heat sink area and then having to combine that with a fan to be able to keep the output transistors cool. Pioneer used the tried and true method, a big old heat sink, one for each channel mounted on opposite sides of the chassis. And that's one of the reasons why the SX1980 weighs around 90 pounds, which is about 30 pounds more than the Marantz. It's a beast. I rebuilt my Pioneer SX1980 a few years ago, and I want to go through a little bit of what this receiver was like to rebuild, comparing it to the Marantz 2500. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the 2500 was a challenge for me to restore. There's not much difference between the 1980 and the 2500 as far as starting out to open up the chassis, getting the knobs off, getting the face plates off. You go about that in pretty much the exact same manner for both of them. My main gripe with the 2500, right, was at the bottom of the chassis, where it was difficult to work on the assemblies down there because they didn't give you very much slack in the cables, and many of the cables were wire wrapped onto the board, so you would have had to remove 20 or 25 wires to get these assemblies out of the chassis. Now, I was able to work on them, and it wasn't impossible to do. It was just more difficult than what I felt it had to be. Now, the SX1980 has even more point-to-point wiring, so you would kind of think, well, this is going to be even worse. But it wasn't. It was quite a bit easier to get these assemblies out. And the number one reason was because they gave you plenty of slack in the cabling. So once you got the tie wraps undone, you were able to move these assemblies where you needed them. You could get them outside the chassis. Now, they were still hanging by a bunch of wires that were wire wrapped, but that was okay because you could maneuver it where you needed to. You just had to be careful not to bend the wires back and forth too many times or you're going to break them like any wire. But the Marantz, there was not enough slack in those cables, and so everything was difficult because some of them had connectors, but then you remove the connectors and the point-to-point wiring they had was just too short. It wasn't too short to assemble it. They got it together, obviously, at the factory fine, but it was going to make it much more difficult to work on it like I had to work on it when I was going to restore it 50 years after it was built. Not everything was difficult in the 2500 as you saw before. Many of the modules came right out and I was able to work on them easily. The 1980 the same way. There's several modules that just come right on out of the unit, but just like the 2500, it's kind of a combination. Some of the boards have several wire wraps. Some of the boards just pull out with connectors. And as I was mentioning, both of these receivers were designed at the same point in time. So the engineering of both of these receivers, how they were manufactured, and the parts used are very similar between both the 2500 and the 1980. I just wanted to talk a little bit about both receivers and the differences between them. But as I said, there's a lot more similarities between them than there are differences. Either one of these receivers, you get it restored and they'll operate well for decades to come. I used the service manual to find the idle current adjustment procedure as well as the DC offset procedure, and I did that before installing the 2500 back into its wood case. Now I'm getting ready to bench test the 2500. What I'll do first is hook it up on the test bench just with a pair of small speakers that I have here on the test bench. Make sure that everything seems to be working fine. Let it warm up a bit, and I'll just let it sit there for a few hours and just sort of cook along and make sure everything's okay before I start bench testing. I have my signal generator, my multimeter, my audio analyzer, along with the Marantz 2500 and my load resistors. And I'm going to just go ahead here and start doing a little bit of testing. And at the moment, I've got a 1000 hertz sine wave running into the auxiliary port of the 2500. And I've got running here now about 2.5 volts per channel. And it's just sitting here idling along more or less. So at this point, what we can do just to see what our distortion is on each channel, I can go ahead and look at that. And it's about 0.02% on the left channel, and on the right channel it's about the same. So that's very good. This unit is rated at 250 watts a channel at 0.05% distortion into 8 ohms. So that's well within its range. So we'll go back here and take a look at both channels again. And as I said, we're running about 2.5 watts per channel, and I'm going to go ahead. Well, you know what I'm going to do first, just real quick, while I got the probes. It's sitting down there hanging in front of my analyzer. I'm going to just turn this down for a second, and I can get in here. These leads here are going to the load resistors that are sitting up here on the 2500, and there's a little gap in here you probably can't see that I can get my get my multimeter probes down in there, and I'm just going to see what the DC offset is. Yeah, haven't looked at that, so let's see what we got. And this is the left channel, and we've got about 6 millivolts, a little under 5.89. That's fine. Let's see, get in here. Try not to short anything out, right? And we've got just a hair over 6. Yeah, 6.05, 6.1 millivolts. And we'll go back here and just look at you again for the fun of it. Yeah, just about the same. So we got 5 or 6 millivolts of DC offset, which is excellent. That's just where we should be, and about as good as you can get. So, and you know, for you guys that don't know, DC at the speaker outputs, ideally you want that to be 0 volts, no DC voltage at the outputs. So when you've got just 5, 6 millivolts, that is, we'll call it 0. So I'm going to turn this back up again a little bit. I'm turning the volume control here on the 2500. And we're back a little higher than we were before, like 3.7 volts, 3.5. I'm just going to turn it up here a little bit because we were sitting at 2.5 before. Okay, that's a good spot. We're sitting about 12.5, 13. And let's just take a look again at the distortion. And I'm looking at the left channel again, and just about exactly the same as when we looked at it when it was when we were sitting at 2 volts instead of 2 watts instead of 12 watts, and it's about 2.08. So I'm going to go over here to the B side real quick, which I say B because the sound analyzer is a channel A and a channel B, which correlates on a piece of stereo equipment to the left and the right channel. So when I went to channel B, I actually changed over to look at the distortion on the right channel. And once again, it's just about identical to what it was when it was down at 2 watts. So we'll go ahead and go back flat here again. And we're right there at 12.5, 13. So we're going to turn it up here a little bit. As I said, I'm not going to push this hard. There's no reason to. I mean, am I ever going to even run, like right now I'm in the middle 30s. About 34 watts per channel. And am I ever going to run this continually at 34 watts per channel? There's not a chance. There's not a chance, because I'd be peaking at its beyond, most likely in most music, I'd be peaking beyond its capabilities. But that's very good. By the way, this has a built-in fan, and right now it's running on low. You probably can't even hear it. You really can. Even this, as close as I am, I can barely hear it. Now, if it goes into high speed, oh man, you'll hear it. It roars. And the reason this unit needs a fan is the heatsink assembly is pretty small. It's kind of like a tunnel. And really, for the power of this particular unit, they had to use a fan. You just wouldn't be able to keep it cool. So right now there's a fan running. It's just moving a little bit of air through there. So as I'm talking here, though, we're just sitting at 34 volts, 34 watts or so. And I say volts sometimes because sometimes I'll look at the volts instead of the watts. And as you guys know, Ohm law, well, you can either look at this at watts, which most people think of their stereo equipment is capable of so many watts per channel, but it's also capable of so many volts per channel, but stick with watts here. So I'll go ahead and look at the distortion. Here we are, just about the same again, just about identical. And I'll go over here, that's the left channel. Now I'll go over to the right channel. And again, just about identical of what it was when we were down at just a couple watts a channel. So that's outstanding. We'll go back flat again. And just touching the unit, it really doesn't feel warm at all. I'm back here touching it. The load resistors have a little heat to them. And I'm putting my hand back here. Yeah, it's blowing a little warm air. You know, the fan's blowing some warm air out of those, out of the heat sinks, that little tunnel where the power transistors live. So, I'm gonna go ahead and keep running it up here a little bit. Not gonna go far. You know, I'm just not going to do it. It's not worth blowing it up. As I said, again, I'm really just worried about the transformer more than anything else. But here we're at about 50 watts a channel. And I'll go ahead and look at the distortion there. And once again, it's practically not changing. Right? We're 50 watts continuous. And again, this is continuous. This isn't music peaks. This is pegged right there at 50 watts a channel, and that's the left channel. Now we'll go to the right channel, and again, 0.02. It hasn't changed. And I would be willing to bet you that if we kept going, it wouldn't change all the way up. But this is being pushed harder than this receiver will ever be pushed. Once again, as I said earlier, if you're doing 50 watts is your low point with your music, you better have an amplifier that's as big as this one. Now, did you hear that? I don't know if you could hear that, but the fan kicked on. And it's much louder. I mean, it's you probably can hear it. I hope you can hear it. But because normally you don't hardly hear it at all when it's on low. But now we've got it running hard enough. And sure enough, if you go back here, I can't get down here on the heat sinks, but I can feel the air blowing out of that tunnel. Yeah, it's warm. It's warm. So normally, I've never ever had that fan come on when I'm listening to it. And I'll listen to it loud. Because normally what's happening, right? You're listening to music and you got those peaks, but it's not pegged there at 50 watts per channel. Of course, if you ever had music playing to the point where this fan kicked on high, you're not going to hear the fan anyway, right? You're not going to hear much of anything except your ears ringing. As well as this Marantz 2500 did on the test bench, it's not perfect cosmetically, as you've seen in this video. And if you guys have seen my videos, I could care less if they're in perfect condition. I know I'm a little bit odd that way, because I'll see everybody talking about how their receiver's in pristine condition, or they're looking for one that's mint. I could care less what it looks like. Because this unit tells a story. It operates like a new unit does, or as close to possible, or as close as it can to a new unit. It just doesn't bother me that it's not perfect. In this particular unit, it sits on a shelf. Doesn't sit in a glass case. Sits out. Gets dusty. You know, most of the time I don't let it get too terribly dusty. But it does. It gets a little bit dusty. And the case, even though it's an original case, it's all banged up. It's all scraped up. And that's all okay with me. Because it operates well. And it just tells a story. For me, it tells a story of what it went through. Probably, I don't know the whole story. I do know that guy found it at an estate sale out in Texas. The guy bought it from, he didn't know nothing about it. As you saw earlier in the video, this 2500 had several different issues, and almost for sure they didn't all happen at once. They just kept piling on. Something failed 25 years ago, then something failed 20 years ago, then 15 years ago, then finally it got to the point where somebody just stuck it in the closet and said, I'm done with it. And it sat there until I got it. I estimate I had probably 40 hours into this project between repairing the 2500 and restoring it and testing it and going through everything. So it took some time. But as you guys know, I'm a hobbyist. I don't do this as a profession. So no big deal to me, the time. And the money involved was minimal. Most of these parts are pretty inexpensive. I didn't have to replace anything that was expensive at all. And I've probably got not much more than $100 in parts. But one thing I want to bring up is for you guys who expect somebody to work on this equipment for you. Anybody who's going to be competent, it's going to be a big job for them. Even though I'm not a professional, and maybe a professional could do it quick, quicker, it's still going to take a lot of time. And any of you guys who call electricians or plumbers or anybody to your house to do anything know how expensive things are. So if you purchase one of these units and you expect someone else to work on it, expect it to be a very expensive repair / restoration, whatever you need, because somebody's going to have to spend a lot of time on this unit, and it's going to cost you at least several $100s for the labor, if not over $1,000 for the labor. Then you got to throw in the parts and the whole 9 yards. So this is why I put together my videos in the format that I do. My videos try to show you how you may be able to repair your own equipment, whether you obtain one at a flea market, whether it's one that you've had for years that has now got issues, whatever the reason, because the major cost of repairing or restoring vintage audio is the labor. The parts generally are not that expensive. There's some exceptions to that, but generally it's all about the labor. So if you've got the time and you've got the patience to learn something new, and you've got some minimal equipment, you may be able to do this yourself. And in today's world, where it's getting more and more difficult to find a competent technician, you may have no choice but to work on your own equipment. Have a Marantz 2500 sitting in a room. People are going to gravitate toward it. Whether you're older like me and you've got a general idea, hey, that's an old piece of stereo equipment, or you're a younger person wondering, what is that thing? Now, what's it sound like? It goes without saying, it's effortless as far as power is concerned. Let me just say it's enjoyable. And that's the main goal in this hobby, is to enjoy it. And this 2500 is a joy to power up and to listen to music through and to look at. What more can you ask for in a piece of vintage audio equipment? I hope you enjoyed the video. I know it was a long one. There was a lot in here. And any of you guys that are still hanging after your 6th beer or 6th cup of coffee, I really do appreciate you watching it. And if you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up down below. And for you non-subscribers, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more of them, please subscribe. And as always, thank you so much to my present subscribers. Y'all have a good day.